In this video, we'll be testing the Coleman PEAK1 2-person tent for its ease of setup, spaciousness, rain protection, comfort, and more. Out of the box, this is what I got. The carry bag with the setup instructions, the tent body, the footprint. Underneath that is the rainfly with pre-attached guidelines, 2 long poles plus a short ridge pole and 10 stakes. Very briefly, here's how to set up the Coleman PEAK1. First, lay the footprint on the ground, then place the tent body on top of that. After that, crisscross the 2 long poles over each other, and each end of the poles is to be secured in the corner grommets of both the footprint and the tent body, so 2 grommets for each pole tip. Then secure the 13 pole clips. These clip the body onto the poles and there are no pole sleeves at all. The short ridge pole is to go on top of the long poles, and there are 2 extra grommets above the tent doors for securing this. After that, drape the rainfly over the tent with the single red webbing on the rainfly matching the red webbing on the tent body. Then stake the entire tent down, including both vestibules, and guy out the pre-attached guidelines. Altogether, the entire setup takes about 7 minutes. Taking down the Coleman is just the opposite of the setup, and it took just slightly over 6 minutes. It compacted down easily, the carry bag wasn't a tight fit at all, and everything fit back in just fine. For more details, I have a separate video with loads of instructions and tips to help you set up your tent more easily. The peak height in this 2-person Coleman tent comes in at slightly over 40 inches. I also measured the height at the extreme right and left widths of the tent, and they both came in at about 34 inches. That's because this tent comes with an extra ridge pole at the top. You can see it here from the inside. The edges of this ridge pole give you the extended peak height, and this also creates 2 vertical walls inside the tent, which helps the tent feel a bit roomier. From the outside of the tent with the rainfly, here's exactly what the ridge pole looks like, and you can see sort of the extended height throughout the tent. As for the other wall, the tent slopes downwards from the peak height with no extended peak height. Now, my height is only about 5'3", so this peak height was more than enough for me. Here's what it looks like with a 4-inch sleeping pad in the tent, and here's a 6-inch queen bed, still with more than enough room for me. For the base area, I first measured the length of the PEAK1, and that came in at about 88 inches. Then I measured the width, and that came in at 50.5 inches. Overall, that's a total base area of almost 31 square feet. As for the pad sizing, here's my Expert Megamat Duo 10, which is the size of 2 regular pads put together. It fit quite nicely with quite a bit of leftover space for storing gear on the floor. Here's roughly what it looks like. Take note that the extra width left though is only about 7 inches here, so if you want to fit wider 25-inch pads, it'll be a very snug fit all the way to the edges of the tent. As for anything wider, it won't fit at all. When I tried to inflate an almost queen-size bed, here's what happened. The length of the tent was still fine, but the width was way too short for something this big. It looks like it fits fine because it just seems to fill up the entire tent, but it actually bulges out the sides of the tent, putting stress on the fabric, so not a good fit for sure. The PEAK1's 2-person version comes with 2 vestibules, 1 at each length of the tent. I measured the width of each vestibule, and that came in at about 26 inches. So on top of the inner base area from before, this gives us an extra 8 square feet for each vestibule, or a total of just slightly under 16 square feet for both vestibules. Each vestibule comes with 2 stake downs, 1 for each panel of the vestibule. You can use either side to stick the vestibule down. This allows you to keep either the right or left panel open. Now, if you don't need the vestibule at all, you can unstake it completely and tie the whole thing up, because there are 2 toggles here, 1 for tying up each panel. I thought the fabric was a little bit droopy, but overall not a super big deal, I guess. Each vestibule has just 1 zipper. I couldn't find any branding on them, so they're no-name zippers, but that's okay, because the zipping experience was decent with no snags at all for me. And here's a feature you don't typically see in backpacking tents, a window at the back of the tent so you can look out while just lying around. This window has 2 layers to it. First, the mesh layer, and second, the fabric layer. If you want to have the window completely open, you can tie both layers back with the toggles. There's one toggle for each. When the window is open, the longest length is 24 inches, the longest width is 22 inches, and it comes in this like triangle shape. Now, if you want to use the mesh layer to keep out the bugs, you can just zip it up while having the fabric layer still open. The holes in the mesh aren't the smallest I've seen, but they're smaller than regular mosquito netting. As for the other side of the tent, there's no window there, so just one window for the entire tent. For the zippers, both the mesh layer and the fabric layer have just one zipper each. These are the same small, no-brand zippers as the vestibules, but the zipping experience is decent with no snags at all. Now, when you shut the window completely, that doesn't mean completely no ventilation, because it can turn into a rainfly vent that's held open with a kickstand, which you can open and close even from the inside of the tent, not just from the outside. The vent is pretty big, plus the angle is perfect too, facing downwards, so it doesn't let any water in, even in the heavy rain. I also thought that it was a nice touch that the window can be open and closed from the outside too. Under each vestibule, you'll find one door each, so 2 doors altogether. To keep the doors open, there's a toggle by the side to hold the door fabric out of the way. The sides of the doors are decently big, measuring about 45 by 28 inches each. Although maybe it doesn't look very big because, like I said back in the vestibule test, the fabric was a little bit droopier than I would have liked. This also cuts a little bit into the cross ventilation when both doors are open, but overall, a rather small con. Each door has 2 zippers. These are the exact same small and non-branded zippers we saw back in the vestibule and window tests, and the zipping was pretty good, with hardly any snags, especially when zipping each door up. The doors are rather long though, so sometimes it's a bit hard when unzipping for the zipper to get past this bend, so either slow down here or use both hands. Don't stress the zipper track. Other than that, it's good to go. For storage, there are 2 pockets, both at the head of the tent. These are triangle shaped, kind of small, not super practical, and each pocket measures about 12 inches in longest length by 10 inches in longest width. On top of these pockets, there's also a small gear loft at the top too. It's almost just as small as the pockets, measuring only about 13 by 11 inches. There are 3 felt loops at the top of the tent for hanging this up, while the gear loft loops are plastic instead. The loops aren't very big, you can't hang like bigger lanterns up, so you gotta stuff it into the gear loft instead, and that's like half your space gone. Next, seam taping. Basically the seams on the tent that aren't covered by the rainfly, like those on the yellow flooring, and this area where there's a gap in the rainfly too, these seams have been taped perfectly. Everything else apart from these were not taped because they're covered by the rainfly. As for the rainfly itself, all the seams were taped. Now, we have what Coleman calls this tub-like floor that runs all around the entire tent. There are seams in the corners and down the side, but no seams around the edges, hence a tub-like floor, and of course, these have all been taped really well. Now, I put the PEAK1 through about 1 hour of light rain, and it held up well with no leaks at all. So next, I put it through a 1 hour heavy rain test, and here's what happened. After 1 hour of heavy rain, there was not a single drop of water inside the tent at all. I checked all the seams, especially those in the corners, and they did not leak at all during the heavy rain test. Seam taping, good to go. I also checked the part that wasn't covered by the rainfly, no leaks at all. The fabric wasn't damp either, even though there was quite a bit of water running over it. As for the underside of the rainfly, it held up well too, with no fabric leakage too. It wasn't damp at all. As for the vent, it was left open in the heavy rain and it didn't leak too because the angle is just right. Overall, it held up really well in the heavy rain. Now, if you remove the rain fly on hot days, you'd find that there's actually not a lot of mesh on the tent body. I would say that this is about 50% mesh and 50% fabric. The foot of the tent has quite a bit of mesh though, so angle this towards wherever you want to look out at. The other sides of the tent don't have quite as much mesh, sadly. As for materials, the flooring is made of 68D polyester and not super durable, so thankfully a footprint was provided. The rainfly and canopy material is exactly the same, 68D polyester as well. Holes are made of 7000 series aluminum, and the mesh is micro mesh with holes that are about this big. There are 4 guy lines on the tent, all of them are regular shock cord with an easy to use tensioner, and the stakes are these Y stakes. For portability, the 2-person Coleman PEAK1 has a pack size of 22.5 by 9 by 6.5 inches. If you're packing the pole separate from the rest of the tent body, the pack length is almost 22 inches. I like the roll top of the carry bag because the mouth is quite wide, plus I can roll it and compact it down as much as I need to, and the buckle becomes a handle too. There's another handle at the bottom of the carry bag too, and the whole pack tent weighs about 5.9 pounds. If you don't take the footprint with you, the total weight will be about 8 ounces less, and here's the breakdown of all the parts of the tent. Now, how does this PEAK1 compare to other Coleman tents like their most popular Sundome? First, waterproofing is much better. The PEAK1 has a hydrostatic head rating of 2,000 millimeters, while most of Coleman's budget tents have only around 450 to at most 1,000 millimeters. I tested almost the entire range of Coleman budget tents. Some survived just 15 minutes in heavy rain, while the better ones did 30 minutes before the first leak got into the tent. On the other hand, the PEAK1 did 1 hour no problem with no leaks at all. I also noticed the seam taping in the PEAK1 was also much better, while the rest of the budget Coleman tents don't tend to have very many tape seams, not even in the corners and not even in the flooring. Third, the flooring is better quality too. They use 68D polyester in the PEAK1 compared to polyethylene in the rest of the tents. On top of a better flooring, the PEAK1 also comes with a free footprint. To align the footprint to the tent body, make sure to secure the pole tips into not just the grommet of the tent body, but also the grommet of the footprint. The pole tip was a little bit short for this though, but it still worked out fine. The poles in the PEAK1 are made of 7000 series aluminum instead of fiberglass, which most Coleman tents are made of. Even the stakes are higher quality. There are these beefier Y stakes, while the rest of the tents come with these thin shepherd hook stakes. I also liked the carry bag of the PEAK1. It's a roll top dry bag. It helps to compress everything down nicely, and it was never a chore to pack everything back in. The warranty of the PEAK1 also comes in at a whopping 5 years, which is much longer than the 1-year warranty for other Coleman tents. And compared to a similar sized 2-person Sundome, the PEAK1 is much roomier thanks to the ridge pole on top. There's also a ton more mesh on the PEAK1 than the rest of the tents, which is so much better for ventilation. And most backpacking tents out there don't have a star view window, but the PEAK1 has one. I really liked that I could look out during the day while feeling cooler at the same time. And I could even stargaze at night without having to take the rain fly off, which is the biggest benefit of all. Almost everything in the PEAK1 is better than Coleman's budget range of tents, but here are a few cons I noticed. First, the pockets and loops are still very small and don't hold a lot of things. Second, the zippers are still small and fairly cheaply made. Third, although the rainfly on the PEAK1 is much better than most Coleman tents, which have very small partial rainflies instead, but the PEAK1, I wouldn't say it's exactly a full coverage rainfly. What I didn't like is this weird triangle gap in a rainfly. I get that it's meant for more ventilation, but I would much prefer having a full-length rainfly instead and having a guy-out point there to pull the rainfly away from the tent body, like what most other backpacking tents would have. After 6 to 12 hours of heavy rain, this part will start leaking through. Also, on the other width of the tent, the rainfly is full length, but it can be pulled away from the tent body, so there's less ventilation and rain protection. and the poles pack down super long, so not exactly a backpacking tent. Now, this PEAK1 premium tent may be better than Coleman's regular budget-friendly range, but how does it compare to other brands of tents? Check out this video on the screen for a full breakdown. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in that one.